Greetings from D265 Critical Thinking, Reason, and Evidence. This video will address content from the first section of the course's learning resources, lessons 4 and 5 on evaluating arguments. First, in lesson 4, we address two types of arguments and words that are used to evaluate those arguments. The first judgment we must make is this: is the argument we're considering deductive or inductive? Two types of arguments are addressed in this course. The intention of a deductive argument is to establish its conclusion in a way that neither doubt nor exception is possible. This kind of argument, if good, provides evidence that its conclusion must necessarily be true. The other type of argument, inductive argument, contains premises that make its conclusion more or less likely to be true. If we determine that the argument is deductive, we then must determine whether that argument is valid, then if it is sound. These two words have very specific meanings in this course. They only apply to deductive arguments. The premises of a deductive argument are meant to guarantee its conclusion. If we call a deductive argument valid, this means that its conclusion must necessarily follow from these premises. Note that we're not making a judgment here about whether or not the premises actually are true, merely whether the conclusion necessarily follows from them. The next judgment we make in evaluating deductive arguments is their soundness. A deductive argument can only be sound if it is first valid, then it also has true premises. Remember that the words valid and sound only apply to deductive arguments. The other kind of argument or inference in this course is inductive argument. The premises of an inductive argument are meant to give probable support to its conclusion. The words we use to evaluate inductive arguments in this course are strong and its opposite, weak, and cogent or its opposite, uncogent. In a strong argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to be true, not guaranteed, but likely. In this case, the premises have provided sufficient evidence to lead us to conclude with confidence. A cogent argument is first strong, then we've also determined that its premises actually are true. Remember, the words strong, weak, cogent, and uncogent only apply to inductive arguments. Here's an example of each type of argument. The first is deductive, the second inductive. The first, all fruits are sweet, tomatoes are fruit, therefore tomatoes are sweet. Premise 1 claims that anything that is classified as a fruit is also sweet. Premise 2 claims that a tomato is a fruit. If those statements are both accurate, then a tomato must be sweet, or the conclusion is necessarily true without exception. Now, none of us would describe a tomato as sweet, so there's definitely a problem with that argument, but it's not a problem with its logical structure. This argument is valid. The second argument on this slide is inductive in nature. Its premises make its conclusion likely, but cannot make it certain. If this thing I see looks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, I conclude that it is a duck. I could be wrong, though. And thus, this argument is inductive. Now let's look at some cases where errors or mistakes in reasoning occur. There are certain types of these errors that are so common that they have special names. These are fallacies. A fallacy is an argument that contains bad reasoning. In this course, we divide fallacies into two groups, formal and informal. Formal fallacies occur in deductive reasoning, and they're bad because of their invalid structure. Informal fallacies occur in inductive reasoning, and they're bad because of their content. Here are two formal fallacies we learn about in this course. They're called affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. First, a little vocabulary. Look at the first premise in each argument. It's the same claim. If A, then C. A is the shortened form of the word antecedent, which means the thing that comes before. C is the shortened form of the word consequent, which means the thing that follows or comes after. For example, in the claim, if I live in Salt Lake City, then I live in Utah, my living in Salt Lake City is the antecedent, and my living in Utah is the consequent. But if in the second premise I affirm or say yes to the consequent, I live in Utah, this does not guarantee that the antecedent is true, that I live in Salt Lake City, because there are lots of other places I might live in Utah that are outside of Salt Lake City. Hence, affirming the consequent is an invalid deductive argument. Likewise, for similar reasons, denying the antecedent is also invalid or fallacious. If A, then C. If I live in Salt Lake City, then I live in Utah. Not A, I do not live in Salt Lake City. Therefore, not C, I do not live in Utah. This is an error in reasoning because me not living in Salt Lake City does not guarantee that I don't live in Utah. Here's another example of affirming the consequent. If it would help, pause the video and think this one through. If I live in Rome, then I live in Italy. I live in Italy, therefore I live in Rome. Being in Rome is the antecedent, being in Italy is the consequent, but Italy is a sizable country, only a portion of which is in the city of Rome, so being in Italy doesn't require that I'm in Rome as well. Likewise, here's an example of denying the antecedent. If I am in Rome, then I'm in Italy. I am not in Rome, therefore I'm not in Italy. Pause the video and think this one through. Denying the antecedent or claiming that I'm not in Rome doesn't guarantee that I'm nowhere else in Italy. Hence, this is an invalid deductive argument or a formal fallacy. Now, here's a sample of informal fallacies. There are more in the last section of the course. Begging the question takes the form X, therefore X. In other words, it invokes the conclusion of an argument to support that conclusion. No evidence is offered whatsoever. And the fallacy claims that because an error in reasoning has occurred, the conclusion of the argument in which that error occurred is necessarily false. It uses an error which may be irrelevant to the actual conclusion as evidence that the conclusion is not true. Here are some examples of these informal fallacies. Begging the question is a circular argument in which a premise of the argument assumes the truth of the conclusion. Earth is a sphere because the planet is shaped like a ball. Notice this argument merely states the same claim twice. It gives no actual evidence or support for its conclusion. The fallacy is committed when one rejects the conclusion of an argument because that argument contains a fallacy. Here's how that might result in an error in reasoning. The argument on the previous slide that the Earth is a sphere begs the question, so we should reject that conclusion and affirm that the Earth is flat. Notice that the presence of a fallacy is not evidence for whether that conclusion is true or false. And if we treat it as such, we commit a fallacy, engage in bad reasoning, and defy science. Thank you for joining me today for this presentation.